Need for Speed Carbon is a 2006 racing game released by EA Black Box that served as the follow-up to Need for Speed Most Wanted. It came with a lot of hype, which drove Carbon to become the second best-selling game in the Need for Speed lineup, just behind the roughly 17 million sales of its older brother, Most Wanted. Most Wanted was one of my favorite games growing up, and while I've always preferred it, Carbon wasn't too far behind. Several flaws have always held Carbon back from being on that same level as Most Wanted, but more on that later. This video serves as a follow-up to my video 21 years later, NFS Most Wanted is still a masterpiece, which you can watch by clicking the link in the description once you've made it to the end. Need for Speed Most Wanted concludes by taking down Razor, where Mia reveals she was an undercover cop the whole time and had been using you as a means to take down the Blacklist. She hands you the keys to the M3 at the end and lets you escape, while the rest of the Blacklist is swept up by Cross and the Rockport police force. You get into a high-stakes chase with Cross and federal Heat Level 6 cops on your tail, and escape by making that iconic jump over the old abandoned bridge after the blockade was cleared by Mia to let you through. The cops have no choice but to retreat, and you're placed on a nationwide Most Wanted list. Some time passes, and the road you followed after jumping the old bridge eventually leads you to the canyons of Palmont City, which is actually where your journey started before the events of Most Wanted occurred. You were in a high-stakes race against Kenji, Wolf, and Angie, with a large amount of money riding on you to win. Darius wanted that money for himself, so he hijacked the race and brought cops to the scene, which led to everyone getting arrested except for you, as you were allowed to flee. As it turns out, you fled to Rockport City. Darius swapped out the bag of cash that was meant for the winner with a bag of worthless papers, where Nikki proceeded to hand it to you before you fled. You later find out the truth, that the money never went missing, it went straight to Darius, and he framed you for rigging the race. He was the mastermind behind the entire situation. In the prologue cutscenes, the player is seen driving a Toyota Supra. I like to believe the theory that the Supra was just a fill-in meant to represent the iconic 2001 BMW M3 GTR for Most Wanted. There's also the theory that the player acquired the M3 at some point after leaving Palmont but before arriving in Rockport, but I don't really align with that belief. The Supra feels more like a stand-in, especially considering the clear design inspiration behind the livery. But anyway, you escape Palmont at the end of the prologue, go through the events of Most Wanted, escape Cross, and then find yourself looped back into Palmont again. It's unclear how much time passed between the end of Most Wanted and the start of Carbon, but considering Cross is now working as an independent bounty hunter, likely after being fired from the Rockport police force for failing to stop you, it's safe to assume some time passed. Whether that's a few days, a few months, or longer is uncertain, but there is at least some time gap between the two. At the beginning of Carbon, the player is seen driving down the Palmont Canyons when Cross appears and starts chasing you down. You race through the canyon with Cross behind you, only for it to end with you crashing into a semi-truck and totaling the M3. All that work for Most Wanted, gone in an instant. You're then confronted by Cross, who, despite no longer being part of the Rockport police force, still has a vendetta against you. That's why he's working as a bounty hunter for Darius, as they both have a shared interest in taking you down. You're taken in by Nikki, who introduces you to Neville, rest in peace, where you then buy a new car and start your journey of conquering Palmont. At this point, you believe Darius is helping you rebuild your reputation, while you're presumably giving him a portion of your winnings for each race and helping neutralize the threat of other crews taking over Darius's territory. In reality, he's just using you again. After beating Kenji, Wolf, and Angie, Darius reveals his true plan by having Cross handcuff you and cash you out, telling you to leave and never come back. Cross ends up having a change of heart and releases you to Nikki, who puts you back on the road with the new goal of taking down Darius after learning the truth about what he's been doing this entire time. In a way, Darius was responsible for the events of Most Wanted. Without him hijacking the original race, you never would have left for Rockport, never met Razor, never had the M3 stolen, and never crossed paths with Cross. Darius was ultimately the catalyst behind everything, which makes your motivation to take him down even stronger. You work your way through Darius's territory, face off against Kenji, Angie, and Wolf one last time, and then take on Darius himself. After beating Darius, he tells you to watch your back, warning that there's always someone out there who's a little faster than you. He then flees the scene. Overall, I enjoyed Carbon's story, but it definitely feels rushed in several areas, and that largely comes down to the reality that Carbon was put under a rushed development cycle relative to the large scope of the game's initial plan. The foundation of the story is strong, especially with how it ties directly into Most Wanted and loops back to Carbon's prologue, but I feel like a lot of those ideas weren't given the time they needed to fully develop develop. Certain plot points move very quickly, character motivations aren't always explored as deeply as they could have been, and major moments can feel like they come and go without enough buildup. Darius, for example, works well as an overarching antagonist and the mastermind behind everything, but his presence throughout the story feels more limited than it probably should have been. The same can be said for the crew members, where you interact with them just enough to understand their roles, but they aren't given enough time to allow you the ability to develop a deep understanding into their backgrounds and motivations. They ultimately just feel like spectators rather than important characters in the plot of the story. It's not that the story is bad, far from it, but you can tell there was a lot more potential there that wasn't fully realized. With more development time, Carbon's narrative could have been expanded and fleshed out in a way that matched or even rivaled Most Wanted. As it stands, it's a solid continuation that does a good job connecting the two games, but it stops just short of reaching that same level. Story aside, there are both positive and negative aspects when it comes to the actual gameplay of Carbon. I think the expanded customization options are awesome and a welcome addition after the limited car customization of Most Wanted, but it's also very clearly a game from 2006. The livery editor, for instance, is unbearably slow and a pain to work with, so while you have way more creative freedom than you did in Most Wanted, making a livery in Carbon anywhere near comparable to what you can make in Forza would take an absolute eternity because of how slow and clunky the entire system is. Forza Motorsport 2, which came out only a year later, has a much more fluid and usable livery editor, so that's another area where Carbon feels held back due to its rushed development cycle. There's also the cops, which are by far the most disappointing aspect of Carbon. In Most Wanted, the cops were the central component of the game and where most of the fun came from, but in Carbon, they were pushed into the background and had absolutely zero influence on the story. There was no real motivation or reason to actively seek out a pursuit, unlike Most Wanted where they were both fun and rewarding. In Carbon, the cops feel more like annoyances at the end of races rather than fun, engaging, important parts of the story. They also feel a lot more fragile compared to Most Wanted, which lowers the stakes significantly. There's no Heat Level 6 and above outside of the Challenge series, police helicopters were cut, and it's overall a clear downgrade from Most Wanted's system. The cops weren't the focus of Carbon, but it still would have been nice if they had some kind of meaningful presence instead of feeling like an afterthought. Palmont itself is also much tighter and more confined compared to the wide open roads of Rockport, which in my opinion makes cop chases far less enjoyable. It's not all bad though. You don't have to babysit the cops as much in Carbon as you do in Most Wanted, where early heat levels feel like the cops are 85-year-old dementia-ridden grandmas. I also liked that, unlike in Most Wanted where hitting spike strips is pretty much an instant death sentence, in Carbon you can still drive and potentially escape on pop tires, though it's significantly harder. It feels incredibly rewarding when you pull it off. But overall, the cops in Carbon feel more like a burdensome side activity rather than a core and exciting part of the experience. Other than that, the crew member mechanic was a cool idea, but to me it felt like more of a band-aid solution to get around the rubber banding issues that plague Need for Speed titles of this era. Additionally, I don't like that cars in Carbon are split into tiers. There's Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 across exotic, tuner, and muscle classes. And while I understand what they were going for, I feel like it was poorly executed. In Most Wanted, you can take something like a Fiat Punto, upgrade it throughout the game, and use it to beat Razor. You can't take a starter Mazda RX-8 and upgrade it to be competitive against Razor. Each tier has an artificial performance cap, which makes it impossible to beat the game in a Tier 1 car and extremely difficult in Tier 2. To me, part of the fun of Most Wanted is taking a basic starter car, upgrading it over time, and using it to take down Razor. It's so much more satisfying than just buying an already fast car later in the game, and it's disappointing that you really can't do that in Carbon. I started my playthrough in the Alfa Romeo Brera, and tried to push it as far as I could. I made it to about 30% completion before the artificial limits forced me to move on, so I switched to a faster Tier 3 Porsche. While I enjoyed the Porsche, it would have been way more fun if I could have taken the Brera all the way to the end, but speed trap events made that impossible. While you don't technically have to complete every event to beat the story, I'm the type of person who has to 100% everything. Leaving races unfinished drives me crazy. I used the Porsche for most of my playthrough before switching to the Mercedes SLR McLaren in the last 30%. Part of that was just wanting to try something new, but it was also because the Porsche had some frustrating handling characteristics that were especially exacerbated in the later stages. No matter how much I tuned it, there was always this underlying understeer that I couldn't fully eliminate. To me, Carbon's handling is lighter but more prone to understeer, while Most Wanted feels heavier but much more planted. In Most Wanted, you can point your car in a direction and trust that it will go exactly where you want it to. In Carbon, that's not always the case. Adjusting to that difference right after coming from Most Wanted was a challenge. I noticed it in the Brera, the Porsche, and even the SLR McLaren. Strangely enough, despite the SLR being the heaviest of the three, it actually felt the most nimble, which makes no sense, but that's Carbon handling for you. I found myself relying on the handbrake for almost every corner just to get the car to rotate properly, because the regular brakes felt like they did nothing and would just send you straight into a wall. Once I got used to it, it became manageable, but it was a steep learning curve at first. Overall, I found Carbon to be more challenging than Most Wanted. In Most Wanted, I beat Razor on my first attempt without much trouble, whereas in Carbon, it took me several tries to beat Darius. I enjoyed the increased difficulty, but there were definitely moments where it felt artificial because of that good old black box rubber banding mechanic. The balancing could have used some work, especially towards the end where having a crew member feels mandatory because the AI can rubber band so aggressively that you'll get completely left in the dust even with a fully upgraded car. Another aspect that's disappointing is that, unlike in Most Wanted where you can unlock special Junkman parts after beating each Blacklist member, those Junkman parts are completely absent in Carbon. Those Junkman parts are so handy in making cars like the Fiat Punto competitive against Razor, but with the artificial performance limits of each car class in Carbon, there was no reason for those Junkman parts to exist. Still, it would have been nice to have that option. Building a sleeper mobile is always more fun than just buying something fast from the start. It might sound like I don't like Carbon based on everything I've said so far, but that's not the case. I do enjoy the game, but because of its rushed development cycle, there are areas where it clearly feels lacking. Team battles are another example. They were originally meant to play a much bigger role, but due to time constraints, they were simplified significantly. There are also teams and cars shown in promotional material that never actually show up in the game itself, or if they do show up, they are reduced to minor roles. Scorpios is one such example. Scorpios was intended to be a major team on the same level as Kenji's Bushido, Angie's 21st Street Crew, and Wolf's TFK. But Scorpios was ultimately cut and rendered an unimportant minor crew that barely shows up and has zero role in the story or lore of the game. It was a huge missed opportunity, and it would have been nice to see more teams. In Most Wanted, you work your way up through 15 Blacklist members. In Carbon, you only have to go through Wolf, Kenji, Angie, and Darius. Because of that, it only takes around 12 hours to 100% the story and about 20 hours to complete everything, compared to Most Wanted, which takes significantly longer at 20 to 24 hours to complete the story and 30 to 33 hours to 100% the game. That reduction in content is noticeable, and it really makes you want more and leave with the feeling that Carbon came to an end way too quickly. Most Wanted builds up so much tension leading to your final encounter with Razor and the last pursuit with Cross. Then there's Carbon, where, in my opinion, the end of the game is the most anticlimactic ending of any game I've played in my nearly 26 years on Earth. As mentioned earlier, you beat Darius, he gives you his little speech, then he flees. It's like he faces no consequences for his actions. When I played Carbon for the first time as a child, I assumed that I would get that legendary Audi R8 Quattro at the end of the game as a reward for beating Darius, which was tragically not the case. Come to find out, while you do technically win the car, it's only usable in Quickrace events. I've never cared for Quickrace events, so my disappointment was immeasurable and my day was ruined. That leads into another area of disappointment. After finishing the story, replaying races only gives you $700, which makes it pretty much impossible to keep buying and upgrading cars. It forces you into starting a new playthrough. While the game encourages you to go through multiple playthroughs to try each car class, the choice between exotic, tuner, and muscle has little impact on the direction of the game. The only thing that changes is your starting area. Starting with the RX-8 puts you in Kenji's territory, the Alfa Romeo puts you in Wolf's region, and the Camaro starts you with Angie. Beyond that, the story doesn't really change. Each character's storyline feels separate rather than interconnected, so your starting choice doesn't have much impact on the overall experience. Starting with Wolf doesn't have any impact on your later encounters with Kenji and Angie, while starting with Kenji doesn't have any impact on your later encounters with Wolf and Angie, and so on. On top of that, it's not like you're locked out of the other car classes as a consequence of starting with one car class over the others, which gives you even less of a reason to go through multiple playthroughs. Despite all of this, I still enjoy Carbon overall, but the way the car class and crew systems connect with the story of the game makes no difference and is clearly an area of lacking depth as a result of the time crunch Black Box was put under during development. I would give Carbon around a 7 to a 7.5 out of 10, but if the game had received more development time to further improve and polish the experience, it could have been right up there with Most Wanted as a 9 to 9.5 out of 10. That stuff aside, the drift events in Carbon are easily one of the game's highlights. I never liked the drift events when I was a child because I was terrible at not hitting the walls, but now that I'm older and have years of experience of playing Forza at a high level, it's made those drift events a lot easier than they were when I was a child. Subsequently, they're far more enjoyable. There's nothing quite like stringing together a clean run down a canyon and seeing your score climb past 800,000 points when you cross the finish line. It's absolute euphoria. The drift events are, unquestionably, the best part of Carbon and where I had the most fun. It's disappointing that the drag events from Most Wanted didn't see a return in Carbon, but they were replaced by the drift events, which I find way more fun than Most Wanted's drag events. This is especially the case as Carbon's drift events feel far more rooted in skill than the more RNG and luck-based drag events of Most Wanted. In terms of visuals and sound, there's both bad and good. I like the neon nighttime aesthetic of Carbon, but I've always preferred the gritty industrial look of Most Wanted. Rockport feels more grounded, while Palmont feels more like a stylized game world. Even though Carbon is newer, I think Most Wanted actually looks better overall. Its visuals are cleaner, while Carbon can look a bit jagged even despite playing on the maximum graphics preset and having the benefit of using a modern RX 7800 XT graphics card. The blue tint in Carbon can also be a bit harsh during long sessions. Carbon strains my eyes much more significantly than Most Wanted, where comparatively I can play for hours and suffer no eye strain thanks to Most Wanted's warmer tone and color palette. Sound design is also hit or miss. Car sounds are definitely improved over Most Wanted, but other effects, like tire squeal for instance, are much worse. When I started my playthrough, I was immediately caught off guard by the absurd tire squeal. It was so distracting to the point where it was pretty much the only thing I could process. There's no way to adjust the tire squeal separately from the rest of the game's sound, so it was just something I had to deal with throughout my playthrough. I got used to it as my playthrough progressed, but dealing with that horrific tire squeal in those first few hours of my playthrough was rough. Finally, there's the Challenge series, which unfortunately has the same issue of Most Wanted's Challenge series, where most of the events feel like half-baked side pieces that are mostly a slog to get through. However, like Most Wanted's Challenge series, there are some good ones mixed in to counteract what's otherwise a slogfest. For instance, there's one where you're playing from Cross's perspective during the canyon chase at the start of the game after the prologue. That was a fun twist. The garbage truck event from Most Wanted also made a return in Carbon, which was fun, and I've always enjoyed the RX-7 Canyon time trial. This event has consistently been one of my favorites throughout the years. I remember a few years ago where I basically spent an entire day doing nothing but sweating that RX-7 event to get the best time I could muster. I ended up getting slightly below a 113 by the end of the day, which felt incredibly fast to me and was almost completely perfect other than hitting some signs at the end. I didn't put myself through that this time as I didn't have it in me to spend hours chasing a sub 113. I only ended up finishing with around a 116, so quite a ways off my 113 from a few years back. There are definitely some fun and enjoyable events within the Challenge series, but it's sadly held back by a lot of events that feel more like chores than enjoyable challenges. Another thing I want to touch on that holds Carbon back is the sheer number of cars that are exclusively locked behind Quickrace events. In Most Wanted, there were maybe only 10 or so cars that were Quickrace exclusives, but that number is substantially higher in Carbon. The Audi R8 Quattro after beating Darius is one of them, alongside other cars like the new Camaro, the Lexus IS300, which was previously one of the starter cars in Most Wanted, the 1999 Mitsubishi Eclipse, as well as countless other cars that are solely locked behind Quickrace events. It's frustrating because the cars are in the game, so it makes no sense why they were arbitrarily locked behind Quickrace events instead of being usable in the story itself. I've never cared about Quickrace events, which makes those Quickrace exclusive cars absolutely worthless to me. Carbon also saw the introduction of DLC cars, which, while a common occurrence nowadays in games like Forza, was clearly the start of where EA took priority of profit over everything else. This led EA to having the reputation it has today as being one of the worst and most egregiously greedy game publishers over the last 15 plus years. I wouldn't say Carbon is on the same level of egregiousness as modern EA titles when it comes to DLC and microtransactions, but this behavior is what ultimately led EA down the path that resulted in the tainted reputation they have today. Despite its flaws, Need for Speed Carbon is still a great game that offers a fun experience overall, but it could have been so much better if it hadn't been for EA putting Black Box on a time crunch and robbing Carbon of the proper development time it deserved. If Black Box had been given an extra year of development time and Carbon was released in 2007, it would have been right up there alongside Most Wanted. Unfortunately, because of that time crunch, Carbon is clearly rushed in many aspects, and to me, will always live in the shadow of Most Wanted. But again, despite saying these things, I still enjoy Carbon and I would still rate it as a 7 or 7.5 out of 10. However, it's also disappointing when it could have been a 9 or 9.5 out of 10 like Most Wanted had it not been rushed. But anyway, that's all I have to say for this one. Thank you for watching and going through this reflective journey of looking back on Need for Speed Carbon in 2026. Before you go, please make sure to subscribe, like, and leave a comment down below. Until next time.